The sun barely rose over the quiet village when Grandpa Elias felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. It was subtle at first, like the soft rumble of distant thunder, but then the air itself seemed heavy, charged with an unfamiliar tension. Birds scattered from the trees, and even the river that ran past the village seemed to hesitate, its waters slowing for a heartbeat. Elias adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and looked toward the horizon, where a thin wisp of dark smoke curled into the sky. The Empire was coming. Elias had seen many things in his long life, but the Empire's approach always brought a chill, even to someone as experienced as him. Villagers hurried to secure their homes and animals. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, and the blacksmith abandoned his forge, leaving glowing embers behind. But Elias moved calmly. Beside him, in a small nest of straw, slept Ember, his tiny dragon. She was no bigger than a cat, with scales that shimmered in colors of molten gold and fiery red. Her chest rose and fell with each gentle breath, and from time to time, a tiny flicker of flame escaped her lips, as if she dreamed of fire even in sleep. Elias knelt beside her and whispered, "Little Ember, the Empire is near. But we will not bow. You and I, we will keep the fire warm." Ember opened her eyes, amber and bright, and blinked slowly. She had always been shy around strangers, but she trusted Elias completely. She nudged his hand with her small snout, a gentle reminder that she was ready to face whatever came. From the horizon, the sound of marching feet grew louder. Imperial scouts, clad in dark, gleaming armor, moved swiftly across the open fields. Their horses' hooves pounded the earth like a warning drum, and the glint of metal from their weapons reflected the rising sun. Villagers began to panic. They ran toward the forest, hoping to hide, abandoning crops and tools, leaving the village exposed. Yet Elias stood firm. He knew the Empire feared dragons, even small ones. A tiny flame could be dangerous if it was clever and precise. The scouts entered the village and demanded surrender. Their voices were cold and mechanical, as though the wind itself had shaped them. "We are the Empire. Lay down your arms and no harm will come to you," the lead officer barked. Children whimpered behind closed doors and elders shook with fear. But Elias straightened his back, leaning on his cane, and replied in a calm, measured voice, "This village is under protection. Leave or face consequences you cannot imagine." The officer laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the morning air. He raised his hand, signaling the other soldiers to advance. But then, from the barn nearby, a soft glow began to grow. Ember had moved quietly, unnoticed, and a tiny flame flickered in the corner, casting long, dancing shadows. The shadows stretched and twisted, making Ember appear larger, more threatening than she truly was. The scouts paused. One of them muttered under his breath, and the others exchanged uneasy glances. Elias moved closer to Ember. "Do not fear them," he whispered. "They may be many, but courage can turn the smallest flame into a warning they cannot ignore." Ember puffed a little smoke and let out a tiny hiss as if agreeing. Elias could see the spark of determination in her eyes. She might be small, but she was ready to defend their home. The villagers watched from the forest edge, peeking through trees. They had never seen anything like this. A grandfather and his tiny dragon standing calmly against the might of the Empire. Some of the younger ones whispered to each other, disbelief in their voices, but also a strange hope. Perhaps the stories of dragons were true. Perhaps even a little flame could make a difference. The lead scout stepped forward, his armor clinking, and tried again. "Step aside, old man. You cannot stop the Empire." Elias's eyes met the scout's, steady and unwavering. "I do not intend to stop the Empire," he said quietly. "I intend to show you that courage and care can survive even in the shadow of fear." The scout laughed again, louder this time, but his laughter faltered as Ember's flame grew brighter. The little dragon stretched her wings, tiny but firm, and let out a soft roar that carried more pride than power. Sparks flew from her mouth, warm and red against the morning light. The shadows around her danced like fire giants, and the scouts could not help but step back. Even the lead officer felt a flicker of doubt. Elias knew this was only the beginning. The Empire had vast numbers, strange machines, and cold weapons. But he also knew something the soldiers did not. The heart of a village could be stronger than any army, and the bond between a man and his dragon could turn fear into strength. He reached down and stroked Ember's scales. "Stay close, little one. The world is about to test us, but together we are more than it seems." The scouts, unsure of what to do, began to retreat a few steps, calling for reinforcements. Their voices carried over the fields, but Elias did not flinch. Ember curled closer to him, her tiny body warm and alive. The villagers held their breath, watching, hoping. In that moment, a tiny dragon no bigger than a cat became a symbol of resistance. And Grandpa Elias, with his calm eyes and steady hands, became the heart that would keep the fire warm when the Empire came knocking. As the morning unfolded, smoke and tension thickened in the air. The Empire would not wait long before striking again, but the village had found a spark of hope. A tiny flame, protected by love and courage, flickered in the barn, ready to face whatever darkness came next. And for the first time, the villagers believed that even the smallest guardian could change the course of their story. Elias looked toward the horizon, taking a deep breath. "We are ready, Ember. Let them come." Ember blinked, her eyes glowing warmly, and in her tiny chest, the fire of bravery burned brighter than any army could extinguish. The night fell quietly over the village, but sleep was hard to come by. The Empire's presence lingered in the distance, and the villagers whispered behind closed doors, afraid to even light a lamp. Grandpa Elias sat by Ember's nest, stroking the tiny dragon's scales. Her body was warm and her soft purrs were comforting, but Elias knew that tonight she would need more than warmth, she would need courage. "Ember," he said softly, "tonight is the night. You must fly even if it is just for a moment. We must show them that we will not be afraid." Ember lifted her small head, blinking her amber eyes slowly. She had never flown far before, never in danger, and her wings, though strong, had only carried her over fields and meadows in playful arcs. Now, the threat of the Empire made the sky feel heavy, almost impossible. Elias placed a small piece of meat near her mouth. "Eat this first. You will need your strength." Ember nibbled carefully, then licked his hand in trust. Elias nodded. "Good. Now let us practice a little." He led her outside, the moon casting pale light over the fields. The Empire's scouts were nearby, their fires visible as small flickers on the horizon. Ember's tiny wings trembled as she spread them. She took a small hop into the air, then landed softly. Elias encouraged her, "Higher, Ember. You can do it." The villagers, hidden in the trees, peered out and gasped quietly. They had never seen a dragon like this before. She was small, fragile in appearance, yet she held a certain fierceness in her eyes. If the Empire had known, they might have underestimated her. But to those watching, Ember's courage seemed enormous. Elias guided her to the barn roof. The old wooden beams creaked under their weight, but the roof was sturdy. "Jump, Ember. Feel the wind. Trust yourself." The little dragon flapped her wings, struggling at first, then lifting a few inches into the night air. Sparks of fire flickered from her mouth as she hovered, her small claws gripping the tiles for balance. Suddenly, a sound came from the edge of the village. Imperial scouts were approaching quietly, trying to find villagers who had strayed too close to the fields. Ember's ears twitched and she flared a small flame, bright and warm. Elias whispered, "Show them, Ember. Show them we are not afraid." With a sudden burst of courage, Ember leapt from the roof. Her tiny wings beat rapidly, and sparks flew in all directions. She glided over the field, the soft light of her flames illuminating the grass below. The scouts stopped, shielding their eyes, unprepared for the small but fiery display. Ember's flames were not enough to burn buildings, but they were enough to confuse and distract. Elias moved quickly through the shadows, guiding villagers to safer spots. Some carried lanterns to mark paths, while others set small traps of stones and nets to slow intruders. All of them relied on Ember's distraction to gain time. The tiny dragon swooped low, then climbed high, circling the scouts with confidence that belied her size. Her fire painted the night sky with streaks of gold and red, making it seem as if the village was guarded by dozens of dragons rather than one little creature. The scouts shouted to each other, their voices sharp and panicked. "It is only a small dragon. How can it scare us?" one yelled. But the illusions Ember created with her fire were enough. Shadows stretched across the ground like enormous wings, and the soldiers began to stumble, unsure of what was real and what was trickery. Elias whispered encouragements from the shadows. "You are doing well, Ember. Keep them away just a little longer. We can survive this." Ember responded with a small roar and a concentrated burst of flame, lighting a path of dry leaves that crackled and sizzled in the night. The fire did not harm anyone, but it made the Empire soldiers cautious, slowing their advance. For the first time, some villagers dared to step out from hiding. They worked quietly, setting more small fires and creating diversions. Ember responded to their actions, flying between them and the enemy, her tiny body moving with grace and purpose. Each swoop, each flicker of flame inspired hope. The villagers realized that courage could come in the smallest forms. Even a cat-sized dragon could change the tide of fear. Hours passed and Ember began to tire. Her wings drooped and her flames flickered weakly. Elias called her back to him, stretching out his hands. "Come here, little one. Rest. You have done enough for tonight." Ember landed softly, curling against his chest. The villagers, watching from the shadows, felt a wave of relief. Their tiny dragon had flown for them, had protected them in a way that no human or weapon could. The Empire scouts retreated slightly, confused and wary. They reported back to their commanders, speaking in hushed tones about the small but fiery dragon that guarded the village. The soldiers could not understand how something so small could make them hesitate. But Elias understood. It was not size or strength that mattered. It was courage, precision, and heart. Ember had all three in abundance. Elias stroked Ember's head and whispered, "You are more than a little dragon tonight. You are the heart of this village. And they will remember that." Ember purred softly, closing her eyes, tired but proud. The villagers returned to their homes slowly, encouraged by what they had seen. They realized that even in the shadow of a powerful empire, they had hope. A tiny dragon, guided by love and trust, had shown them that survival did not always depend on weapons or numbers. Sometimes, it depended on the courage to rise, even when the odds seemed impossible. The night ended with a quiet calm, the fire in Ember's nest burning gently. Elias looked up at the stars, thinking of the battles yet to come. The Empire would return, stronger and more determined. But now they knew the village had a guardian. Ember's first flight was not just an act of defense, it was a statement. Even the smallest creature could make a difference. Elias whispered once more, "Rest now, Ember. Tomorrow we will be ready again." Ember curled into a ball, her tiny body warm and glowing faintly. The night was still, but the fire of bravery burned bright. And in that moment, the village understood something they had never realized before. Hope could take flight, even on wings no bigger than a cat. The sun rose pale and thin over the village, but there was no peace. The Empire had not left. Their scouts prowled the fields, and distant hums of strange machines warned that a larger force was coming. Grandpa Elias stood outside his small cottage, Ember curled against his chest, her tiny warmth comforting against the cold morning air. He knew the Empire was clever, they would not attack carelessly. They would set a trap and the village had to be ready. Elias walked to the edge of the forest, surveying the open fields that the Empire could use to advance. His mind worked quickly, planning ways to turn Ember's size and fire to their advantage. "Little one," he said, kneeling to meet her glowing eyes, "they will think they can surround us. But they have no idea what we can do together." Ember flicked her tail and let out a small hiss as if she understood. She was small, yes, but clever and brave. By midday, smoke appeared on the horizon again. This time it was different. The Empire moved in larger numbers, their armored machines clanking as they rolled toward the village. Soldiers marched in lines, their weapons raised, ready to crush any resistance. Villagers hid in their homes or fled to the woods, frightened but trusting Elias to guide them. Elias gathered a small group of villagers who were willing to help. "We cannot fight them head-on," he explained. "We must trick them, confuse them, and make them believe the village is stronger than it seems." The villagers nodded, their fear tempered by determination. Even small fires, Elias knew, could become powerful illusions if used cleverly. As the Empire's soldiers set up near the village edge, Elias and Ember began their work. The little dragon hopped onto the roof of the barn, stretching her tiny wings. Sparks danced from her mouth as she warmed herself in preparation. Elias had gathered dry leaves, small branches, and pieces of cloth. He scattered them across the hidden paths, creating patterns that, from a distance, looked like larger movements. When the soldiers advanced again, they saw what seemed to be many fires moving across the village, accompanied by shadows that looked enormous in the flickering light. Ember swooped between them, her small body carrying sparks and arcs that tricked the eye. Soldiers stumbled, shouted, and hesitated. The illusions made it seem as though dragons larger than barns guarded every corner. Elias moved silently among the villagers, ensuring everyone was safe. He whispered instructions: "Move the lanterns here. Step on the left. Ember to the right." Ember responded with quick, precise flights, guiding the sparks and shadows where they needed to go. Her flames lit up the night, creating the illusion of a vast army of dragons circling the village. The Empire's officers grew uneasy. "This is impossible," one said, his voice tight with fear. "They have dozens of dragons. How can it be just one?" The soldiers began to argue, some wanting to advance, others hesitating. Every step forward seemed uncertain. Their confidence faltered under the clever tricks of a tiny dragon and a clever grandfather. Elias smiled faintly. "They will respect courage," he muttered as Ember dove low, sending a trail of sparks along the dry grass. The soldiers retreated slightly, unsure whether to charge or flee. Ember flared her tiny flame at their feet, careful not to harm anyone but enough to scare and confuse. The fire hissed against the leaves, creating sudden flashes that made shadows leap and twist. Villagers, encouraged by Ember's bravery, began to work more confidently. Some set small barriers, others guided the animals to safer areas. Each movement was subtle but amplified by Ember's fire and the shadows it cast. Even the youngest children watched from safe spots, learning that courage and cleverness could outweigh sheer numbers. The Empire's commanders could not understand what they faced. Their machines rumbled, but their soldiers hesitated, unsure of the threat. Each spark of Ember's flame seemed to multiply into dozens. The Empire had not prepared for cleverness, for the ability of a tiny dragon and one old man to create chaos from simplicity. As night deepened, Elias guided Ember to higher vantage points, giving her new angles to create illusions. Sparks flew over fields and rooftops, making it seem as though invisible dragons patrolled the village. Soldiers who tried to approach were met with sudden bursts of fire, always precise, always controlled. Ember's size made her unpredictable. She could hide, swoop, and strike in ways a larger dragon could not. The village held together, inspired by what they saw. Even those who had been afraid joined in small ways, carrying lanterns or moving supplies quietly. The Empire's trap had been expected, but Elias had turned it to their advantage. What the soldiers thought was weakness, the village's size and Ember's tiny form, became their strength. Finally, the Empire began to retreat slightly, unsure how to proceed. Their reports to commanders were cautious, almost reverent. They did not know that only a little dragon and an old man protected the village. They could see the fires and shadows but could not grasp the cleverness behind them. Elias brought Ember back to the barn, letting her rest in her nest. She curled into a tiny ball, flicking a small flame to keep herself warm. Elias looked out over the village, quiet now but still alive. "You did well, Ember," he said, stroking her scales. "Tonight, we showed them that courage and cleverness can protect what matters." Ember purred softly, tired but proud. She had flown farther than ever before and had used her flames to save lives. The villagers, seeing her bravery, realized that protection was not always about size or strength. Sometimes it came from intelligence, timing, and heart. Elias knew the Empire would return. They were patient, relentless, and powerful. But the villagers had learned an important lesson. Even the smallest guardian could turn fear into hope. Ember's fire, tiny yet precise, had transformed the village from a target into a symbol of resistance. That night, the fires in the village burned gently, a mixture of Ember's tiny flames and lanterns placed carefully by villagers. The illusions were gone, but the courage remained. Even as sleep returned to the people and animals, the lesson was clear. The Empire might have numbers and machines, but the bond between a grandfather and his little dragon was stronger than any weapon. Elias whispered one last time to Ember as she drifted to sleep, "Rest now, little one. Tomorrow we prepare again. But tonight, you showed the Empire that cleverness and courage can win." Ember's tiny chest rose and fell, warm and steady, her flames dimming but her spirit brighter than ever. And in the dark of the village, under a sky full of stars, the little dragon had flown, the Empire had been confused and hope had grown. The trap had become a lesson, that even the smallest fire, if guided wisely, could change the course of events. The village woke to a quiet morning, but the air was heavy with tension. The Empire had not given up. Their scouts still lingered on the outskirts, and distant hums of armored machines warned that another strike could come at any moment. Grandpa Elias walked through the village with Ember perched lightly on his shoulder. Her tiny claws pressed gently against his coat, and her glowing eyes scanned the fields. Despite her size, she moved with confidence, aware of the danger but not afraid. Elias stopped at the village center, where the people were emerging cautiously from their hiding places. Farmers returned to their fields, children ran to see Ember, and the elderly watched, hope flickering in their eyes. "We have survived the night," Elias said quietly. "But today we must show the Empire that the heart of this village is strong. Ember will help us and we will help her." The villagers listened carefully. Elias instructed them on small but important tasks. Some placed lanterns in hidden positions, while others set up barriers using carts, nets, and stones. They learned to move silently and work together, trusting each other and the tiny dragon who had already flown above the enemy and survived. Ember twitched her wings in approval, letting out a soft hiss that seemed to encourage the humans. By midday the Empire's forces had advanced closer. Soldiers, accompanied by machines that rumbled like distant thunder, marched toward the village. The villagers felt a mixture of fear and determination. They had seen Ember's courage and now they were beginning to believe in their own. Elias gathered a small group near the barn, whispering, "Stay close. Watch Ember, follow her lead, and remember that even small actions can make a difference." Ember hopped to the roof of the barn, spreading her wings fully. Sparks flickered from her mouth, lighting up the wooden beams. She flared her tiny flame, then swooped down, sending streaks of light across the open fields. The soldiers stopped and stared. Even trained troops were confused by the flickering patterns and dancing shadows. They hesitated, unsure whether they faced one dragon or many. The villagers began to take action. A few of them guided animals to safety, while others placed small fires along paths to confuse the Empire. Each movement was small, but combined with Ember's flight, it created the illusion of a larger force. The little dragon swooped low, brushing close to the soldiers' legs, sending sparks into the dry grass. The soldiers jumped back, startled, unsure how to respond. Elias watched with pride. Ember was no longer just a tiny dragon, she had become the symbol of the village's courage. Every flap of her wings, every puff of flame, inspired the villagers. Children who had been too scared to step outside now helped move lanterns, hiding behind crates and barrels, learning that bravery could be quiet and clever. The Empire's officers grew frustrated. They shouted orders, trying to regroup their troops, but the illusions and Ember's unpredictable movements kept them off balance. Soldiers tripped over hidden barriers and stumbled in the shadows, unsure of the fire's size or source. Elias whispered to a group of villagers, "Do not be afraid. Use your eyes and hearts. Ember is with us and together we are stronger than they expect." Hours passed in careful coordination. Ember flew tirelessly, her tiny flames creating patterns that led the Empire's forces into confusion. Sparks danced across the fields, over rooftops and between trees. The shadows of Ember's wings, amplified by the fires, looked enormous. The Empire could see movement everywhere but could not tell what was real. It was cleverness against power, heart against steel. The villagers worked quietly, learning from Elias and Ember. Each action, though small, became important. They realized that courage was not always loud or violent. Sometimes it was precise, careful, and clever. The Empire's numbers and machines were large, but the village had something they could not measure: unity and belief in one another. As night approached, the Empire's troops grew weary and cautious. They had expected an easy conquest, but they had been met with strategy, courage, and a small dragon who seemed larger than life. Reports to commanders were careful, describing shadows and flames that made the soldiers doubt themselves. The Empire had underestimated the village, and now they feared it more than before. Elias brought Ember down to the barn, letting her rest in her nest of straw. Her wings drooped, and her tiny body glowed faintly with warmth. He stroked her scales gently. "You are the heart of this village, Ember," he whispered. "You showed everyone that even the smallest creature can inspire courage." Ember curled close to him, her eyes half closed but still alert, as if understanding her importance. The villagers gathered nearby, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. They realized that their fear had been replaced with hope. They had watched courage in action, seen strategy in flames, and learned that even the tiniest guardian could make a big difference. The Empire might return, but the village had learned that they could stand together, guided by wisdom and bravery. Elias looked over the rooftops as the night sky darkened. The stars reflected in Ember's eyes, and he felt a quiet pride. This was more than just defending homes, it was teaching a lesson that would last longer than any battle. Courage, cleverness, and trust could hold back even the mightiest forces. That night, the village slept more peacefully. Fires burned softly in the barn and in small lanterns, providing warmth and light. Ember rested on Elias's shoulder, her tiny body glowing faintly, a reminder of the day's triumph. The Empire had tested them, but the village had endured, not through weapons or machines but through heart and cleverness. Elias whispered one last time before closing his eyes, "Rest, Ember. Tomorrow we stand again, but today, you showed the village who we are." Ember purred softly, her warmth spreading through the barn. The villagers, inspired and united, understood that courage could come in the smallest forms, and that even a little dragon could be the heart of a village strong enough to withstand an empire. The morning air was crisp and quiet, but the village was alive with a sense of relief. The Empire had not yet returned, but the villagers felt different now. They had faced the shadow of a great force and survived. Grandpa Elias walked through the streets, Ember perched lightly on his shoulder, her tiny claws gripping his coat. Her scales glowed softly in the morning sun, a reminder of the bravery she had shown. Elias stopped at the edge of the village, looking out over the fields. In the distance he could see the Empire's machines moving slowly, their troops still hesitant. Word of the tiny dragon and the clever village had traveled faster than any soldier could move. The Empire's commanders had heard the reports. Soldiers confused by shadows, fires that seemed alive, a dragon no bigger than a cat who had defended an entire village. "Little Ember," Elias whispered, "they are watching now. They will not come carelessly again." Ember flicked her tiny tongue, sending a small spark into the air, her eyes bright with understanding. She had been through so much, yet she remained calm and alert. Elias smiled. She was no longer just a little dragon, she was the symbol of the village's courage. Villagers emerged from their homes, their eyes bright with hope. Children ran to Ember, giggling as she flicked small sparks into the air in playful arcs. Farmers returned to their fields, tending to crops that had been neglected in fear. Even the elders spoke quietly of pride and wonder, amazed at what one tiny dragon and an old man had accomplished. The Empire scouts arrived later that day, moving cautiously toward the village edge. They had been ordered to observe, not attack. The soldiers' faces were tight with fear and respect. They had seen Ember fly, had felt the confusion her tiny flames could create. They had underestimated the village and were now learning a difficult lesson. Courage could take many forms and size was not always strength. Elias met the scouts calmly. "Welcome," he said simply, his voice steady. "You have come to see the village. You will see that we are not weak, but we do not seek war unless it is forced upon us." The scouts looked at him, then at Ember, who flicked a small flame toward the sky. It was a show not of attack but of presence. The flames danced like ribbons of gold and red, tiny but impossible to ignore. The lead scout, a tall man with worn armor, stepped forward. "We heard the reports," he said quietly. "It is true. One small dragon protected an entire village." Elias nodded. "Yes. And this village survived not because of size or weapons, but because we cared for each other, and because courage can appear in the smallest forms." Ember purred softly as if agreeing. The scout lowered his head, acknowledging the truth of Elias's words. The other soldiers exchanged glances, understanding that the village was not an easy target. They had come expecting fear, but they had found bravery, cleverness, and unity instead. The Empire's commanders would now approach with caution, and some would think twice before attacking villages that could defend themselves so cleverly. Elias turned back toward the village, Ember following closely. "They will remember us," he said softly. "And they will know respect, little one. That is as important as any battle we could fight." Ember's tiny wings twitched and she let out a small hiss of agreement. She had been part of something larger than herself, and she knew her role had mattered. The villagers gathered in the center of town, sharing stories of the past nights. They spoke of Ember's first flight, of the sparks that confused soldiers, of the careful strategies that kept everyone safe. Children listened with wide eyes, imagining a dragon small enough to fit in one hand but brave enough to stand against an empire. Even the adults felt pride swell in their hearts. They realized that protection was not always about power, it was about heart, trust, and cleverness. Elias watched as Ember moved among the villagers, letting small flames flicker along the edges of lanterns. Her fire warmed not just the barn, but the hearts of everyone around her. "You see, Ember," Elias said, "even the smallest can make a difference. You have taught the village what courage looks like." Ember purred, brushing her head against his hand. She was tired, but her spirit remained bright. As evening fell, the Empire scouts withdrew. They reported back to their commanders, careful with every word. They spoke of a village defended by one tiny dragon, of illusions and shadows that made an army hesitate, of a grandfather who guided his people with wisdom and calm. The Empire had learned something important. Respect must be given to courage, no matter how small it appears. The villagers lit fires for warmth, not as traps or illusions, but as a celebration. They had survived, and they had learned that strength could come from unexpected places. Ember curled near the largest fire, her tiny body glowing warmly. Children gathered around her, reaching out to touch her scales, laughing softly as she flicked little sparks into the air. Elias stood nearby, looking at the scene with quiet satisfaction. The village had faced fear and had not broken. They had learned to trust one another, to follow courage even when it was small and fragile. Ember had shown them that heart mattered more than size, and that cleverness could outmatch brute force. That night, the village slept with a sense of safety. Ember rested on Elias's shoulder, her body warm and glowing faintly. The fires burned softly, not as weapons, but as a reminder that they had endured. Outside, the stars shone clearly, reflecting in Ember's eyes as she drifted off to sleep. Elias whispered to her, "You did well, little one. The Empire has learned respect. And the village will remember you always." Ember purred softly, her tiny flames flickering in rhythm with her heartbeat. Together they had turned fear into hope, weakness into strategy, and a tiny dragon into a symbol of courage. In the days that followed, the Empire did not return. Word of the village spread quietly through the land, a place where a little dragon had kept the fire warm, where a grandfather had guided his people with wisdom, and where courage, no matter how small, had been stronger than an empire. The villagers rebuilt their lives, smiling more freely, working together, and remembering that bravery could come from anyone, even the smallest, most unexpected friend. Elias and Ember stood together often, watching over the village. Every day the dragon grew a little stronger, her flights a little longer, her flames brighter. But it was not power alone that mattered, it was the love, trust, and courage that she and Elias shared. They had shown that even a tiny flame could leave a mark on the world, and that the Empire, mighty as it was, must always respect the heart that dared to resist. And so, the village thrived, warmed by Ember's fire and guided by Elias's wisdom. They had faced the Empire and they had endured. Courage, cleverness, and heart had won the day. And in the soft glow of the little dragon's flames, every villager knew one simple truth: even the smallest guardian can change the course of history.